go back to the Gospel of John, chapter 2. Now it says, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. The Passover, the Jews went to Passover every year. They were to remember how they came out of Egypt, how the Lord delivered them. And Jesus, well, the deliverer himself, the main deliverer, the one who's going to deliver the people from their sins, well, he's going to Jerusalem. And it says he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and money changers doing their business. See, the animals, they were used for sacrifice. God told them, to remember Passover, you got to take a lamb and you got to kill it. You got to take the blood, to remember the blood that they took from the killed lamb, that they put around their doorposts, so that the plague of the firstborn wouldn't affect them. So they were remembering that. So they were bringing their sheeps in for sacrifice into the temple. But, people had set up a business within the temple, actually selling all these animals, and they were making a good profit off it. They were ripping the people off. They probably were telling them, hey, you get closer to the temple, your sacrifice is going to be more worthy. So they were charging some big bucks. And Jesus, he saw all the stuff that was going on, all this selling. And boy, it wasn't too happy. You see, what they had was they had a system, a religious system that was going on, but it was more for greed. To show you how bad it got, if you remember the high priest Annas, okay, he was the high priest at the time of Jesus. Well, there's actually two high priests. There was Annas and Caiaphas, who was his son-in-law, but he was just his puppet. He was installed by Rome, Caiaphas was. But the guy that was really in charge was Annas. And he had a bunch of sons that ruled, and they were just his puppets. Well, one of them was a guy by the name of Annas the Younger. And there's an account in history that talks about him. And Annas the Elder was around at the time of Jesus. He was still alive at this time. And let me read you that account to show you how greedy these men became. It says, the high priest Annas, after he had been relieved from his office to some degree, was respected and feared by the people, but in a bad way, for he loved to hoard money. And he became good friends with Albinus and of the newly installed high priest. And he did so by offering them bribes. And he also had wicked servants who associated themselves with the most vilest of people. And they went to the thrashing floors and took the tithes that belonged to the priests by force, and beat anyone who would not give the tithes to them. So that the high priest that followed him, as well as his servants, acted likewise, without anyone being able to stop them. So that some of the priests who were old and were being supported with those tithes died for lack of food. Boy, they got so greedy, they were actually taking away all the food that the priests had to live on, the ones that were actually serving in the temple. That's how pathetic they were. And, well, this was the sort of stuff that was going on here. Back to verse 15. Oh, back to 14, I mean. The money changers, they were doing their business. They were doing their business in the temple. See, history also records what the money changers were doing. See, 15 days before before Passover, they were sent out to collect what they called the half shekel donation. And that was around, in our currency today, that was around $5. And everybody was supposed to give this donation to help support the temple. So they went out and they were collecting money from the people. And then 5 days before, according to historical records, they went into the temple area itself and waited for the people to come to them, because they all had to bring their sacrifices. Now, history records that there was about 256,000 lambs that were slaughtered in one account from the historian Josephus. And one lamb could be used for up to 10 people. So you had at least 2 million and 2.5 million people that were coming to the temple. That's a lot of money that they were bringing in, besides the money that they were making off all these animals. So it was a kind of a greedy thing. It's a big money maker. Now, what were the people? It says in verse 14, there were people that were selling doves. What were they doing there? What were they doing there? See, the doves really didn't have nothing to do with the Passover. But see, what happened was, when a woman had a child, after so many days they were to come to the temple, and they were supposed to bring a burnt offering and a guilt offering to be offered up. And if you were poor and you couldn't afford to bring a lamb, you could go out and get a couple doves and you could have them sacrificed. Well, what was happening was the religious leaders, they found out a new way to make some money. They told these people, well, if you have a child, you got to bring the sacrifice. But you also, if you have more than one child at home, you got to bring a sacrifice for every child you have. In other words, they were telling the people something that God didn't tell them, because they wanted to make more money. For example, if a woman had one child and she had 4 other children at home, she'd have to bring 5 sacrifices to the temple. They were doing that to make some money. And history records that things got so bad in the temple at this time that the price of 2 birds were going for what they said was 1 gold zuz, which was about a half an ounce of gold. In today's currency, that'd be $600. Oh yeah, they were ripping the people off. Well, there's an account that happened, probably 20 to 40 years after Jesus cleared the temple. There's an account about a man by the name of Gamaliel. And he was actually a descendant from Gamaliel, the one whom the Apostle Paul was trained under as a Pharisee. And in this account, he accounts this, how they were ripping the people off. And he made a decree that, the Lord's word needs to be followed, and only one sacrifice needs to be brought to the temple. So after he gave that decree, the price of birds dropped. It dropped down all the way to $2.50. And the poor people, they could afford to bring the sacrifice once again. So this is a situation in which Jesus comes into. He sees it going on, and he gets sick of it, and he sees these cords, these ropes that are lying on the ground from them bringing their sheep in. So he grabs a bunch of them and he starts putting them together, and he makes a whip. And he starts driving these people out. Verse 16 says, he said to those who sold doves, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. A house of merchandise. You know, got to be careful today, because there are some churches out there that's what they're doing. They're making the Lord's house a house of merchandise. And it's not there to be a house of merchandise. See, in the Bible, Jesus clears his temple twice. This was the first time. He's going to clean it again. Because see, these people, they're not going to listen to him after he cleans the temple. They're just going to go right back doing what they were doing. And he says to him, he says, how dare he turn my Father's house into a house of merchandise? A house should be called a house of prayer. And he calls them a den of thieves. That's what they're doing, ripping the people off. See, they were adding things to what God said, to make it a requirement for the people so that they could make some more money. And sometimes certain churches, for example, to give you one example, certain churches say that in order for you to be a member of the church, you have to tithe. Now, there's nothing wrong with tithing. It's supporting the church and the people, your teachers and people working in the church. But understand something. You're not a church member because you tithe. Jesus purchased you with his blood. You can't buy your church membership. And yet there are certain churches out there that demand that. Well, that ain't biblical. You're adding to the Word of God. It don't say that. Some people do the same thing with their elders. You want to be an elder? Well, you're going to have to tithe. Well, that ain't in the Word of God. It might be a good principle, but it ain't in the Word of God. That's not a requirement. You're part of his church because you belong to him. You're part of his body. He bled and died for you. Don't be putting money on it.